Hi there, I'm Scott with Artist Network and welcome to Drawing Together. This is a pre-recorded episode of our normally live drawing sessions where we join together to practice and improve our skills with drawing. So I welcome you all. Feel free to open up the reference image. You'll find that in the description below the video. Bring that up and you can follow along with me. Feel free to post any comments you may have as well in the video below, and I'll do my best to follow up with any questions. You'll also find additional resources at Artist Network where we have a page dedicated to drawing together, and I'd love for you to explore all the other episodes that we have as well. So let's dig right into it. This is the subject we're working on today. This is a version I did in advance of this recording to help kind of work through some of the ideas. This is the reference image that I have pulled up, and you can see the print isn't quite as rich as the digital image, so I'll be working back and forth between looking at this reference photo that's printed and the one that is on a digital screen. So to get started, we're also going to look at the materials. I'm going to be working mostly with this Ebony Pencil. It's a very soft graphite pencil. It's an extra smooth version of it. It's equivalent of about an 8B if you have a graphite pencil. That gets pretty dark. You'll find that you can get quite a long ways even if you have just a regular number 2 pencil. So if that's all you've got, feel free to dig right in there using that material. I'll also be working with this carbon pencil. That's going to allow me to get a little bit darker in some of these areas here. I've got my trusty shading stump that'll help to replicate some of the texture there. And of course my 2 erasers, my rubber eraser, which is really getting well used now, and my kneaded eraser. I'm working on 11 by 14 Strathmore drawing paper. And you can see that I've already got it toned. So with this ebony pencil, I've taken a razor blade and I've carved away some of that wood casing to expose the core. And I've kind of been filing it down, just working back and forth across the page, just building up a tone of graphite on that surface. I want to get rid of all of that light. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to really kind of enrich the environment that the bird is in. In this reference photo, there's a lot of space behind the bird, and it's very much silhouetted against that. I did some Photoshop work to pull out some of the detail in the bird so I could really see what's happening in the wings and the feathers and the texture there. So I kind of adjusted it a little bit so it's largely really but this dark silhouette against that light background, but I want to create some texture on that background, and that may be something that you choose to ignore. It can be kind of dynamic to place a drawing just on a plain white paper. But I felt for this drawing, there's so much white space. I didn't want it to feel empty. I want to keep everything in the drawing active. Everything in the drawing should feel like it's playing a part, and it should feel intentional. So even if there's nothing there, even if you're leaving parts of the page blank, it should feel like an intentional choice to do that. And that you really build that you build that sensitivity to your drawings as you go. You get to really start to see, as you explore your own work, does it feel that way to you, and use yourself as a guide that way. So all I'm doing right now is I'm taking an additional pass. I'm looking at some of these areas where it's a little bit darker, and I'm starting to just lightly fill in the spaces between them to create a bit more of an even texture there. And I can see I've got this kind of flow to my marks that are all kind of following my natural movement, moving left and right here. So I'm going to change up the directions, throwing in some vertical marks, doing some cross hatching. And I'm not too worried about texture on this one. I don't need it to be perfectly smooth. And in fact, I think we're going to have a lot of fun with the texture today, utilizing the kneaded eraser and utilizing this toned background. So this is really just setting the stage for the bird. And one of the things I can do now is I can really make a more abstract kind of rendering of that background. Lots of vertical lines I'm seeing there, but I can't really make out. There's a kind of a field of cattails there and tall grasses that has been so blurred out by the camera that you can't really make it out. So I'm just going to kind of create some texture, really thinking more gesturally about the form, kind of reacting to what I'm seeing in the photo rather than making an explicit rendering of anything back there. And you may choose for yourself that you want to spend more time in that background, but in this case, I want to get into that bird and I just want to create some sort of kind of landscape there. So I don't know if you can kind of hear it, but it's skipping across the surface as I'm moving up and down, and just kind of tapping and moving at the same time to create an irregular and kind of mottled surface here. And what I want to do is kind of create a little bit of variety. So maybe what I'll do is I'll lighten up this area down in here that's going to be largely covered over by the tail of the bird. And then maybe kind of darken it up in here against that head. And I want to kind of do it somewhat subtly. I don't want it to be a really strong element. I don't want the eye to be distracted by variations in there, in that background. But by varying that background, I think it's going to help me to create a sense of depth in the overall drawing. And I think it's healthy to continue to kind of build it up, layer that texture in that background. It's not something that you're going to hit right just the first pass. It's going to just get richer and richer as you take you take multiple stabs at it and build up the layers. And it's really not taking a whole lot of our time, but I think it's worth it to try to invest in kind of setting the stage for drawing the bird. So fairly light at this stage, but I think it's doing enough to create some variety in that background. So with that largely established, and I think I'm feeling pretty good about it. It's going to keep reshaping the eraser to get kind of more varied marks. But I think with that in mind, I think we're pretty much ready to start working on the bird. And what I want to do is kind of propose the idea of working from the inside out to find the form of the bird. And in part, this just may be a way to get you to think differently about the form, perhaps. This is a way I like to think when I paint. Rather than thinking about creating an outline and then filling it in, I want to start from that central axis and work my way out to find the form of the bird. In part because it's going to help me to create the volume of that bird. I don't want it to feel like a flat silhouette. I want to feel the three-dimensional quality of that bird, how it really wraps around. And so if I start with that central axis, I can start to determine the scale of the bird. In the early version that I did, if I pull that back up here, I made the bird fairly small. It's pretty consistent with the reference photo, actually a little bit smaller than what you're going to see in the reference. There's a bit more space around it. And I kind of like that in a way. It pulls us into the drawing. It's a little bit more intimate, but I'm also responding strongly to it. I feel like it's too small on there. So I'm going to see what happens if I make that bird a little bit larger. And so what I want to do is kind of look at the spacing around the edge of the drawing of the paper. And as I work on that central axis, there's a general angle that the bird is taking. Work my way out to try to block in that form and giving myself some subtle marks to indicate where that head might be. Again, kind of working my way out to try to find the line along the bottom of the bird, working my way up to find the top. And my eyes are moving very quickly back and forth between the reference photo and the drawing. And I have to be careful because I'm looking at this at an angle and it's going to skew my perspective a little bit. So this is where it's going to be really helpful for you to be able to step back or work vertically with the drawing. So again, started with that central axis, I'm just kind of working my way out above and below that line. And I'm trying to think about it in terms of shape rather than line. And that can be a challenge for some beginning drawing students. There's a very natural tendency to want to go right into drawing the outline, the contour line of the bird, and then, like I said, filling it in. What can be a challenge, though, is that when we're confronted with the white page and we start by drawing those lines, we're often incorrect with our kind of proportions. It's not really an accurate way to to understand the form of the bird by looking at just the outline. We interpret it a little bit differently. And so in this method, we're really addressing the form right out of the gate. And then we can find the line, and we can add some really nice variety. We can continue to control the proportions. But if we start off by thinking of the bird as a three-dimensional object, then it's easier for us to maintain that thinking throughout the whole drawing. If we start by thinking about contour lines, it just becomes additional work to really kind of get rid of those lines and make this three-dimensional shape of the bird. So hopefully you can kind of see what's starting to take shape here. I'm utilizing the side of my pencil, so the lead is just kind of scraping across the surface rather than using the tip. So if I use an overhand grip, or a tripod grip like this, like I'm writing, it's going to take the point and it's going to embed it into the page. It's going to create an embossed line, which is going to be more difficult to erase later on. So if I tip it on its side and I scrape across the edge, then it becomes a bit more flexible. I'm starting to just utilizing the side of the pencil, kind of create some rough gestures, looking at the various shapes for the feet and the branches. And there's a lot going on in this area, and I don't want to take the time to figure it out at this point. I just want to get it roughly sketched in, and then I can ask myself later as I go through the drawing how specific I need to be in that area. So one of the lovely things about drawing is that you're in control about how much you finish. Do you want the whole thing to be in sharp focus? Do you want just a small portion of it? What's really important to you in drawing has that power to really kind of reflect our decision making and reflect the mind of the artist. So decide for yourself how far you want to go in terms of that detail. At this point, I'm just thinking gesturally, reacting to the forms and the shapes that I'm seeing in this area and trying to let my hand just kind of respond to that. I like students to think about drawing similar to that of a seismograph, where we're taking in all this information, it's being processed through a brain, coming out our arm onto the page, much like a seismograph translates the energy of the earth during an earthquake. You just kind of responding to it and letting that flow out naturally. And the more you practice, the greater hand-eye coordination you'll develop. You'll end up gaining greater control over your artwork that way. So I have some rough forms established here, and I need to ask myself if this is looking correct. Now I can start to adjust the forms. I'm not really utilizing the stick here as a guide, but I think I need to start to do some negative drawing and cut back into the form of the bird a little bit. And it's really healthy as well to try to think about the positive and the negative space. If you're new to a drawing and you've never heard those terms, the positive space is everything that is the object. So in this case, it's the bird. That's the positive space. It has a particular shape. The negative space is the space and the shape of the space around it. So there's a particular shape to this hole here between the legs. And I can compare that to the reference image. And I can utilize it if I think back and forth between positive and negative space. It's going to give me a better understanding of the form of the bird. As we draw, we tend to make kind of assumptions, or we end up having preconceived notions about how the form looks, and it's often difficult to see it any other way. So looking at the negative space just is a way to clear the mind a little bit and try to be a bit more objective, because we know that as we draw, we gradually get locked in to our drawing. And we'll often stick with things that are incorrect, just because we've kind of become accustomed to it. So still utilizing the side of my pencil, I'm just starting to refine the shape a bit more. Still trying to think about working my way out to find those edges. Moving my eyes back and forth very quickly between the reference photo and the drawing. And if I'm doing any line work, I'm still trying to keep my pencil on its side to keep that line delicate. I don't want strong lines at this point. And as you look at the shape of the tail, look for that overall arc that it makes, and then you can start to break it down into smaller and smaller bits where you can look at each feather and see how it has a particular and unique shape to it. So as if at this point, in this case, I drew a line down here and I started to shade in. I want to make sure that line gets consumed by the graphite in the center of the bird and to create a shape. Again, I want to get rid of those lines as much as possible. And one of the things that's really fascinating about this form is the relationship between convex and concave curves to create these compound curves here. So especially along the back, we see these kind of rounded forms, and then it gets intersected by another kind of rounded form here, and then we have another one here. So there's this general angle and a general curve, but then if you break that down, you see that it's an accumulation of three smaller, kind of shorter, more distinct bumps there. And so I kind of exaggerated that, and I need to be careful about those lines because that just works against exactly what I was saying earlier about trying to get rid of those outlines. They're a bit strong right now. And part of the reason of that is that I want this to feel rounded. If I let those edges kind of lower in contrast, be lighter than the values in the interior of the bird, if it's darker here and then lighter around that edge, that's going to really help to round that out. So I just want to be careful about those lines that I'm creating. I still have a ways to go in terms of value. I can make this whole thing quite a bit darker. So I'm not too concerned with that, at this point. So now I'm kind of moving my way up to find the shape of this open beak, and I really questioned whether or not I should try to render the beak as closed. But the more I kind of looked at this, the more I really kind of actually responded positively to that open mouth. I thought that added some nice kind of action. It's kind of an odd form, so that's why I was kind of considering getting rid of it, and kind of closing that mouth. But I decided I'm gonna leave it as the reference photo works. Now, speaking of reference photos, I always recommend working from life as much as possible. In this case with a bird, I would never be able to allow this bird to be able to sit long enough for me to really study it this way. So I'm kind of grateful for the opportunity to take a photo that I can draw from and really study it. And then if I were on location, I would be using the opportunity to create gesture drawings, really study the way the bird moves and flows through the space, and not being concerned with the details as much as the movement. So as I go across here, as you can see what I did with that beak, I think I want to play with the value relationships a little bit. So I just kind of shaded in that bottom edge. I'm going to erase out that light across the top, and then maybe slightly darken that background, kind of feather that out. I want that to be fairly subtle. But in this case, generally the bird is dark against a light background, and if I flip that here up in the beak, where now the beak is light against a darker background, that could provide me some interesting opportunities in terms of space and form and depth. So just want to be really kind of subtle here. But I want it to be dark enough to create that contrast where I can erase out the beak. But I'm going to get back to that later. I'm not at the finishing stages yet. I'm just starting to kind of block in the form, but I'm trying to become a bit more specific. Now with this overhand grip that I've got, I'm holding it like this, almost like it's a set of chopsticks, but with it wedged between my fingers and just stabilizing with my thumb and my middle finger, it allows me to kind of roll my hand back and forth, and that allows me to control the pressure as well as the point. So I'm mostly drawing with the side of the pencil, which fills in a greater area. I can fill in much more area than with the point. But if I ever need the point to create a sharper edge, all I have to do is roll my hand a little bit, and there's that fine edge. So we can see the form starting to build here. I can start to look for some of the forms in the bird, and I can start to evaluate the overall proportions, which I feel like this is too big up here. I'm going to make that smaller. So what I need to do is kind of cut this back in with the eraser. One of the things that, if you're new to the series, you may not have heard me say this, but you always want to be contributing to the form in some way. So the eraser isn't just about correcting mistakes. It's an opportunity to refine that form. And you want to think about it as much as of a mark-making tool as anything. And that feels a little bit better in terms of the overall form. And I think I have some kind of work to do in that head when I make another pass, trying to make it more specific. So I'm going to continue to block in some of these values, starting to look for areas of light and dark. Now, as I mentioned, I made some adjustments in Photoshop to this photo, because when I took it, the original photo was just, that bird was essentially just black, except with the yellow patch on its wings. And I could have replicated that photo, but there wasn't enough information there for me to really understand and learn anything about the form of the bird. And for me, that's really important, is utilizing lighting, utilizing an angle and a pose that helps me understand the subject a little bit better than I may have leading into it. And I'm just kind of noticing some proportions, using my eraser to clean up some of the forms. Starting to look for areas of light and dark. And you can see these across the top of the bird, there's this transition of light into shadow. You can see these lines of termination there, a little bit of reflected light under here that gives us a little bit more form. But I also know that this graphite, even with a carbon pencil, is not going to get me a pure black. You might choose to work in in charcoal, which could give you a greater range of values. I'm using this as an opportunity to better understand graphite here and see if we can push that range a little bit. So I'm just starting to refine that form a little bit. And so here's a really lovely example of that compound curve. Across here we have this section of the tail where it curves this way, and then under here it's largely a straight line, and it almost curves in the opposite direction. And those curves are really helpful in terms of creating depth and form. And I want to be careful about building up too much value, too much of this graphite on there. It's going to be more difficult for that carbon pencil to stick to the page. But now I'm doing some negative drawing to visualize where that yellow patch should appear on the bird. So moving back and forth with my eyes as I'm looking at it, and I'm trying to think of two different things at the same time. I'm looking at the width that I interpret of this space, but I'm also looking at the negative space around it. So as I come across here and I determine how far over to the right that yellow shape extends, I'm looking at this distance and asking myself if that feels decent, feels pretty close, and then I'm looking at this distance to see if that feels pretty close. And I'm feeling a bit, pretty confident with it for now. And as with any drawing, you want to ask yourself, what is the tolerance in terms of its accuracy? How accurate does it need to be for you? Is this more about capturing the overall essence and the gesture of the bird? Or is this about creating a photographic representation? You're going to decide for yourself what you ultimately want this drawing to be about. And so we'll get through it, and we'll see. I'm seeing some areas that might be a little bit off, but I don't really quite know. This feels a little bit large to me, but it also could be accurate. I need to give myself a little bit more information before I make that call and start to make adjustments. I've done that so many times where I've gotten to a point where I'm like, yeah, I don't think that the proportion looks correct, and I go ahead and change it only to realize that my initial proportion was actually correct. I had to change something else in the drawing. So that's the thing about drawing, is that it's all about relationships. It's all about how does one thing relate to the other, in terms of scale, in terms of value, in terms of color. Here's another kind of example of that compound curve as I really observe that form on the underside of the bird. There's this kind of slight angle here where you have one curve that goes like this, and then kind of a straight line that comes out this way. And they accumulate together to create that overall shape. A little bit of a wing kind of poking up over here. So I switched to this tripod grip, and I just want to be really careful not to create lines that are too sharp there. I want to just kind of lightly sketch in these legs. Make sure that that's feeling good. So as I do that, I'm looking at the point of contact, comparing it to other landmarks in the drawing, and I'm feeling it's pretty close. I think I need to maybe move them a little bit, but we're in largely good shape. Now I can erase out this form here. So as I'm lifting off some of the graphite here, that wasn't a very precise mark, and that was intentional. I could take all the time I want to kind of really pick out that specific form, but I found it's easier to kind of overstate that, to cut away too much of that, and then come back in and redefine that edge, working both kind of positively and negatively. And so really look at those compound curves there. We have these kind of scalloped edges along here, and then in here we have a change in angle, another change in angle there, and the same with along here. Look for those curves and really try to break up those edges. A little bit of yellow that comes in over here. And again, overstating that, cutting back in with the graphite. And now we're just, as we're going through, we're just gradually getting more and more defined, more refinement. And I think what I want to do is just continually darken this area a little bit more. And if I fade it out, it becomes less noticeable right off out of the gate. You know, it's one of those things where, you know, when a viewer looks at a drawing, there's the initial impression, but then there's the impression that's formed over time as the viewer sits with it. And if you create a soft enough, a smooth enough transition, the change in value, say in that background, just becomes more subtle. It becomes something that the viewer picks up later on as they sit with it. One of the things that I really wasn't paying attention to was the direction of my marks. So the reason I'm darkening this background a little bit is that I wanted to create some value contrast against that beak. And what I was doing is I was running my marks this way, which is parallel to the angle of that beak, and that's actually going to work against the depth that I want to create. So if I change up the direction of the marks a little bit, then I have a value shift and I have a subtle shift in texture that'll help to define that edge. And I'm just smoothing it out. I'm just utilizing the side of my hand to smooth out so I don't get the oils from my fingers on the paper and kind of messing with the drawing. So now I'm going to come back in and with my kneaded eraser kind of lift off that light there. And again, I can overstate it just like I did with that feather. And then I can sharpen it back up, kind of lifting that off. Actually, maybe what I'll do is I'll go right for the carbon pencil at this point. And this is where we're really going to start to see it kind of take shape. Sharpen up that bottom edge, look at that negative space in here. And that bottom beak has this thin sliver of dark. And then it rounds out and we have kind of a softer edge along here. So I'm just starting to refine that form a little bit more. And then as I'm looking back and forth between the photo and the drawing, kind of double checking. I see this black form here. If I continue it up in this curve, then it comes out up here. There's this little notch that gets left over. But there's light striking the top of the head, so I want to be really careful. I want to be mindful of that form. Placing the eye, kind of looking for that shadow underneath the ball, and then there's a little kind of ring around the eyeball, but I don't want to create a solid line. I really want to be observing the shadow shapes more than anything. So look for the shape of light and shadow. Kind of doing some negative drawing in here where I'll darken the space around the eye. Maybe cut that down a little bit. It's a little bit sharp. But you want to be careful to, it's really easy to get in there and then draw 3 perfectly kind of circular marks or something on there to represent the various forms in that eye. But if you look for the shapes of light and the dark, it'll ultimately be more convincing of a form. So utilizing the side of the pencil, and you can see I've shaved this one down too, so I can fill a broader area utilizing this carbon pencil. A carbon pencil is really a fascinating tool. It's a kind of a cross between graphite and charcoal. I don't like that line that I created across that eye, so it didn't really do much of anything. So I might need the rubber eraser. I'll need to take another stab at it. So let me see if I can kind of refine that edge, just using a light pressure around the top where there's greater, there's more light striking the bird, and then I can get a little bit darker in the shadow areas. And it's helpful at this stage to start looking at the grain of your marks to see if it follows, approximately with the texture of the bird. So really kind of study that grain. So I'm utilizing the shading stump to finish blocking in that form. And you can utilize this just like a pencil. Utilize the side of it as well as the tip. And still looking at the reference photo, see if I need to make any corrections or if I can contribute to the form with this. And I can move my marks in the direction of that the feathers are going as well, and that'll help to reinforce that form. So it's a similar technique to what I was doing with that pencil, where I'm holding it in this way that allows me to go into a kind of a broad shape and then into the point of the pencil very, very quickly. Okay, so now he's a little bit soft and out of focus, and I can come back in and now sharpen up some of these edges. This really nice shadow under here. So when I need a sharp point, I can just roll my hand up. And now you can see with that top beak, I really haven't drawn a line across the top. And I'm going to hope that that's going to serve me well later on. If it's not quite defined enough, then I may have to come back in with a line. I made that original eye too big, so now I can kind of cut that back down a little bit. So it often takes multiple stabs, multiple attempts to really get a form the way you want it. And this is again where I've talked about it quite a bit in this series. You know, you think about the word draw and all of its different meanings. You know, in the context right now, of course, drawing refers to the making of an image on a page using, you know, a pencil or some other drawing tool. But we also say we draw other things. You know, we draw water from a well, we draw names from a hat, things like that. You know, generally to draw means to pull out or pull across. And so we're trying to get this drawing to really kind of emerge on the page. We're pulling the image out on the page in front of us. So in a way, we want to be thinking about you know, building the whole thing up as a whole. You know, we've got enough of the form now. Now we can go back in and start to refine some of these forms. But the hope is that we're going to reach a level of completion across the whole drawing. What I'm noticing with this carbon pencil is really slipping across that surface with the ebony pencil. And so I sometimes have to bear down a little bit more. And so in here, I'm looking for areas of light and dark. But I want to be thinking about varying that edge. You know, I want it to be, I want to have some variation where maybe it's a little bit sharper in some areas, a little bit more diffused in others. Looking at these small shapes of dark that represent shadows. And still in general trying to think of working my way from the inside out to help create that rounded form. And then we have this alternating sequence of lights and darks created by the light falling on these forms. And I think it's helpful to really try to keep a mind about these just being abstract shapes. Try not to think, oh, I'm drawing a wing or I'm drawing feathers, drawing a beak, etc. Really look at the abstract shapes and trust them. Trust the angles. Trust the values. And that if you kind of replicate that, you say, I'm not drawing a feather. I'm just drawing a dark mark that's close to the dark that I'm seeing in front of me. Then it'll come together perhaps a bit more effectively. And sometimes what can happen is our preconceptions about how we think we should draw something or how something should look interferes. You know, we have a history of drawing wings to some degree, and there's going to be an instinct to rely on those previous drawings that you've done and a previous understanding of drawing birds. And it may not align with what we're seeing here. So what you saw me do earlier with the kneaded erasers, if I keep a light touch, it starts to kind of smudge and kind of smooth things out a little bit, and it helps to create some nice texture, a little bit more contrast. And there's really kind of more light striking across here. And there's kind of a more distinct angle right in here that I want to replicate. Maybe bring this dark line down a little bit. I feel like that's starting to come together. Again, just kind of working my way down. I don't want to trust that this is all correct. You know, I may need to come in and adjust. Yeah, I might have to adjust it a little bit later. And look for these compound curves. This is generally a straight line along in here, and then just gently curves up and underneath that wing. Gets really dark and under here, so you can hear me bearing down on that, creating a bit more contrast. And one of the things, if I worry about that layer of ebony pencil being too strong, I can erase that back down and then try to come back in with with this carbon pencil on top of it again. So this is kind of really interesting form, seeing how each of these feathers has a unique shape to it. Then you may have an instinct to really make each of these feathers very consistent and even. That's a very natural instinct. And that's one that I'm fighting right now, actually. So I'm kind of forcing myself to find a bit more variation. Sometimes it's necessary to exaggerate that in order to serve the drawing. And again, if you're making variations, you know, some people, you know, will 100%. You want to make the drawing replicate the photograph, or if you're drawing from life, replicate what's in front of you. Other artists will take you know, a fair amount of liberty with that, maybe changing the proportions, changing the value, changing the placement of things, and in order to serve the composition or the drawing in some other way. And you yourself are going to define what works for you. You know, it's one of the unique kind of signatures that you'll define is what the tolerance is, how much you want your subject to vary from reality. You know, so, you know, from all the way from a pure abstraction to then something that is, you know, hyper real beyond the photograph. So, and there's no right or wrong. There's really just what serves you. And what serves the purpose of your drawing. So as I look at these bumps here, I'm really observing that play of light and shadow, trying not to over-define them. And then we have this kind of darker edge under here. I want to be careful, but not to make a solid line there. What I'm trying to do is visualize that path and then bring my marks right up to that path. And that'll make it feel more naturalistic. If I draw a line around it like this, that's a visual cue to my eye that says that's a different form altogether, that's a different shape. And it's likely to kind of hop off the page and flatten out the drawing. And in this case, we want that yellow patch to be integrated into the bird. And so that's where I want to be really careful with my marks there. So now I'm just building up values under here. I'm going to have to really bear down on that, I think. You know, this doesn't get super dark, but I can come close. I'll come close as I can. What's nice about this area is it's a fairly large area, which doesn't require a whole lot of focus and attention. So I can jump into that and jump out. So if as my eye kind of scans the drawing, if I need to kind of clean up an area, I can go in there, apply some more kind of laser-like focus, and that gets exhausting after a while. So then I can move back into one of these kind of more broad areas. And then, like I said, come back into here, kind of let my mind clear a little bit. This takes a little bit less focus, but it can be exhausting, really trying to focus and get these proportions correct. So if you need to walk away, walk away. I think it builds a healthy habit to force yourself to stop early and come back to it. You know, in this case, I want to get this done for you so you can kind of follow along and see the whole thing come together. But you know, there's many times when I'm drawing or painting where I just need to stop, walk away, get a drink of water or something, and come back to it with a clear head. Sometimes that time period requires a couple days or a couple weeks before you go back to an image. So one of the things you want to be careful too and be thinking about is the texture and allowing your marks to reinforce the texture. So in this case, I can see a general flow to the feathers, and I can let my marks kind of follow along those paths. And if you're not sure, a circular mark works great. You know, so you can, in this area here, for example, if it's hard to see what direction the feathers are going, try a circular mark to build up those values. You just want to, you want those marks to reinforce the depth. As you can see, I've sharpened this pencil on both ends. And so I can use this end for really the fine details when I need it. And I can use this end here and here to fill in the more broad areas. And I don't want the whole thing to be in sharp detail. I want this to have some variation. I want to be able to control the focus a little bit because that, to me, creates more of a sense of atmosphere, as though this bird has a place where it could be living within, right? So it's, I want it to be in this space and not just kind of on this flat surface. If it's too rendered, if there's too much detail, it can actually be a little confusing for the eye because we don't often see everything in fine detail. If you think about how much we can actually see as we open our eyes, the area in which we have sharp focus is very, very small. And so, but everything appears to be in focus because everywhere we look, there's something in focus. But if you focus on a small part and then put your awareness on everything around it, you realize that everything else is just very blurred. It's all peripheral in our vision. So now I'm going to get in here and kind of place these legs. I want to be careful not to overstate these lines. So actually what I'm trying to do is, before I establish that bottom edge, I'm just thinking about that texture, rolling these marks around. And I think what I want to do is I want to let this part of the drawing, the legs and the branch, become just a bit more subtle, less finished, as a way to pull the eye into these more areas of sharper detail. And so as I'm going along, my eye is really out of focus as I look at the reference photo because I'm just trying to look at the shapes of light and dark. Sometimes it's really hard to tell in some areas what I'm actually looking at, and I don't want it to necessarily invent. So if I go with just the shapes that I'm observing, I'm going to be in good shape. As I follow that branch, I can see in the photo that it's shaded underneath and light on the top, and it's very difficult to make out where the edge of the light side is. So what I'm going to do is actually utilize the side of my pencil to create kind of a broad mark, kind of putting a little bit more emphasis on the underside of it and letting it be soft around the top. And that's going to help to create this impression of a kind of a subtle shadow. And I'm going to look at, some of these other shapes. Again, utilizing the side, because I want to be thinking about these in terms of shape, not line. And I'm trying to be very gestural with this. I don't want this to be something that becomes all time consuming. I don't have a whole lot of patience myself, and it becomes less interesting to me to render every detail in this branch. But that may not be the case with you. There's no real right or wrong in that regard. It's a matter of what serves you well and what is that drawing experience. That's what we're doing here, is we're capturing an experience on the page here. This is a record of our time together, observing this bird. And so you want to ask yourself, like what is that experience? Do you like that kind of hypnotic quality of really embracing all the detail? Or do you like the gestural quality of this, and the kind of more impressionistic or interpretive nature of some of this process? And there's a spectrum there, right? There are times when maybe you like that sharp detail, that fine rendering, and perhaps there are times when you don't. You just want to get loose and let the lines flow wherever they want to go, and you can let that happen. So, but just I think in general, kind of embracing your nature is really helpful. So again, what I'm doing is thinking very gesturally, and what I mean by that is I'm not taking a whole lot of time to correct any proportions as I get here, because to me that's not really important. What's important is that I understand the general flow of the forms and the textures, and so knowing that the stick creates this long, straight-ish mark across the page, and then the little branches and things are they change the quality. They're kind of shorter, and they're somewhat soft, but they have a particular shape to them. And rather than try to mimic one-to-one what's happening in the photograph, I'm going to try to just replicate the type of mark, the type of mark that I'm seeing kind of play across the page here. And so looking at this through blurred eyes can be helpful with that. Utilizing the side of the pencil allows me to think about this in terms of shape and become more gestural. If I engage the point more, then it becomes more of a challenge. And you can see how quickly I can suggest branches just by utilizing the side of the pencil. And just kind of allowing my observations to flow through my hand and not overthink them. And that gets really fun. It almost can pull me away from the rest of the drawing. But, so now I've created this branch, but it's not super detailed. And hopefully what that's going to do is it's going to pull the viewer's eye to the bird. And that's kind of what happens in nature. This is, when I was out along this trail and I saw the bird, everything in my mind went to that bird. The branch that it was on fell away, the background fell away. And so this, in a way, it captures more of what it felt like to be there and what my mind was engaged with at that time. And so, sometimes we get caught up in needing to feel like we have to render every little detail, but something can be lost in that. If that doesn't kind of mimic the experience that you had on that spot. So just something to consider, that you think about some of these great urban sketchers, it's not about necessarily capturing every detail. It's about being present in that moment, in that space, and allowing your observations to kind of flow out onto the page, because that captures the experience of being there, the experience of drawing, more than a photograph. And something happens in the mind when we do that. We tend to retain that information more clearly. We hold on to that information, I think, longer. So right in here, I'm going to, a thin dark line to pop that lower beak out. And I've really softened that space behind it in hopes that it will create a little bit more depth there. You know, in general, I prefer to be working from life, from live objects, but in this case, like I said, it's very difficult to work from a bird, like this, especially in the wild, and really kind of understand the form. All right. Now I'm just going along the edges, and with the fine point, I'm just kind of sharpening and up some areas. And I want to make sure that I'm not doing it consistently across the whole drawing. There needs to be some variety in there. And I think I need to really even bear down harder right in here. And then right in here, I think it can be a little bit darker. I'm looking at some of that negative space around the legs where they meet the body. His legs are a little bit lighter. So I'm going to darken in the areas around it. So hopefully you're enjoying this. I think we're pretty close to done. You know, I can continue on this for a while, but I'm not sure if I'm bringing anything really substantive to this drawing. So I think I'm just gonna finish in some of these lines in here and then call it a day. I want to thank you all for joining me again with Artist Network. So check out artistnetwork.com for additional resources. You can go to the Drawing Together page. You're going to find a link to that right on the home page at the very top of the screen. We have individual pages built out for each of the episodes, and I've been seeing a lot of you post the work that you've been creating as you're following along. And that's been tremendous to see, and I've been seeing some wonderful growth from some of you as well. The whole goal of this whole series is to utilize this time when so many of us are at home to help improve my own drawing skills. And I figured let's do this together and see if we can get better at drawing, because I want to apply this to my painting. I want to get out there. I want to get into the field. I want to start painting again, and I want to come out of this time period with some renewed skill. And it's something that I've been neglecting for a long time. So I want to thank you all for joining me here. I think I'm just going to kind of touch up some of these final things. I look forward to seeing what you all create. Hopefully this has been informative for you. I can let me try to zoom in a little bit. There we go. You can kind of see that a little bit better now. But hopefully you found this informative and that you're following along. I'm seeing some issues perhaps with the proportions, but I feel like I've got it pretty close. I don't think it's anything that I want to correct at this stage. This has all been about having fun, exploring this form, exploring these materials, playing around with values and shapes, and I feel like we've created something that has served those purposes. So thank you all for joining it. I appreciate it. We are meeting now every Monday and Wednesday. So look for those live links for the upcoming ones. Be sure to subscribe, and you're going to get notifications about when the next ones are coming out. So join the ever-growing group of us that are drawing together. So thank you, and happy drawing.